Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Sterile Ocean. Dr. Yessa Morn had built a career out of telling planetary survey teams when enthusiasm had outrun biology. She was good at it. Most worlds were less hospitable than explorers wanted them to be. An atmosphere could look breathable until trace chemistry destroyed lung tissue. A warm sea could be biologically empty because its nutrient cycle had collapsed. A promising continent could support spectacular microbial life and almost nothing larger. Yessa trusted limits. Limits were useful. Limits made ecosystems understandable. Earth seemed personally offended by the concept. She stood inside the observation gallery of the Pacific Exobiology Institute and watched a relief model of the planet rotate above a table. Blue covered most of the sphere. The humans had rendered depth as color, and the Pacific darkened from coastal shelves to abyssal plains and then to trenches so deep that Yessa expanded the legend twice because she assumed she had misread it. She had not. That cannot be correct. Dr. Celia Brodie looked over from the next console. The human marine biologist wore a faded institute shirt, loose work trousers, and the patient expression of someone who had already had this conversation with several visitors. The depth, Yessa pointed with one of her smaller manipulator arms. That trench. It's correct. An unprotected caudron body would be destroyed almost immediately at that pressure. Celia nodded. An unprotected human body wouldn't enjoy it either. That was not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. Yessa returned to the model. Her species had evolved around broad, warm seas broken by island chains. Caudron oceans could be dangerous, but their habitable marine zones remained comparatively shallow. Earth's seafloor seemed determined to place itself as far from the atmosphere as gravity permitted. She opened environmental overlays. Temperature fell. Light vanished. Pressure climbed. Nutrient availability changed with depth and current. Vast areas of the ocean were cold, black, and far removed from the sunlight that powered most familiar food webs. Yessa highlighted the narrow, illuminated layer. Complex marine life should become sparse rapidly below this depth. It does, Celia said. Yessa relaxed slightly. Celia added, relatively. Yessa's neck membranes tightened. Relatively to what? The really crowded places. That is not a scientific unit. No, but it's emotionally accurate. Yessa ignored her and pulled up biological density estimates. The model populated with markers, not uniform abundance, not anything close, but enough. Deepwater organisms, benthic communities, migratory life, scavengers, microbial systems, entire ecosystems operating far below the depth at which Yessa had expected complexity to become exceptional. She stared at the display. Nothing complex should live in most of this ocean. Celia folded her arms. You should probably be more specific before Earth takes that personally. I am being specific. You're going to have a difficult week. Yessa looked at her. Celia smiled. That was the first warning. Chapter 2. Every piece of equipment is a confession. Yessa expected Celia to correct her with papers, charts, and archived survey data. Instead, the human asked whether she had ever been diving. Yessa looked up from a reef biodiversity report. Into water? Yes. Submerged? That's generally the idea. Yessa waited for the missing part of the sentence. Celia waited too. You mean inside a vessel? Number scuba, shallow water. The Institute has a caudron-adapted breathing system that was certified last year. Yessa's upper manipulators went still. You cannot breathe water. Correct. And you enter it anyway. Yes. Is this an occupational requirement? Not for you. For humans. Celia shook her head. Plenty of us do it recreationally. Yessa stared at her. Humans entered an environment in which they could not breathe for recreation. She considered several possible explanations. None improved the statement. Why? Celia thought about it for a moment. There's a lot to look at. That afternoon, Yessa discovered that human recklessness was much more organized than she had expected. The equipment room contained backups for systems she had not yet learned could fail. Celia placed a closed-loop breathing unit on the table. This is adapted for caudron respiratory chemistry. Medical cleared the gas mix from your records and will do a full fit and function check before we get near the water. Yessa inspected the regulator assembly. What happens if it fails? You switch to bailout gas. Celia set down a secondary cylinder. Yessa looked from one breathing system to the other. You carry another breathing system in case the first breathing system stops breathing. Yes. Next came buoyancy control. Yessa's body was denser than a human's, so the Institute had adjusted the lift system. What happens if that fails? We can dump weight and establish positive buoyancy. A depth computer followed. Then a thermal layer, mask seals, communications gear, an emergency beacon, and a cutting tool for entanglement. Yessa lifted a manipulator. Entanglement. Lines, damaged netting, kelp, usually nothing dramatic. Usually, Celia sighed. You're going to do this with every piece of equipment, aren't you? Every piece appears to be a confession. A confession. Humans encountered a way to be injured and then built an object admitting that the problem exists. Celia considered the table. That's not the worst description of safety equipment I've heard. The humor disappeared once training began. They practiced loss of breathing gas, mask failure, buddy contact, emergency ascent, buoyancy problems, and hand signals for when the communicator could not be trusted. Celia made Yessa repeat procedures until she could perform them without pausing to translate the instruction. When she explained ascent control, Yessa stopped her. Descending changes the gas loading in your tissues. Yes. And ascending too quickly can injure you. Yes. So entry into the environment is dangerous, remaining in it is dangerous, and leaving it incorrectly is also dangerous. Celia glanced at the dive plan. We're going to 20 meters. Yessa waited. Celia frowned. That was supposed to help. It did not. Still, something had changed. The humans did not believe the ocean was harmless. They had not forgotten that they were air-breathing land animals entering an environment that could kill them through several unrelated mechanisms. They simply considered those mechanisms problems to be managed. Yessa was not sure whether that made the activity more sensible. It did make it harder to dismiss. Chapter 3. The reef. The ocean looked manageable from the boat. Then Yessa entered it. Support vanished. Sound changed. Light fractured against the surface. Her body no longer knew which direction counted as stable, and every instinct built on generations of terrestrial movement demanded a floor that was not there. Celia stayed directly in front of her. Slow breaths, the human said through the communicator. Don't fight your buoyancy, let the system carry you. Yessa obeyed. That helped enough for panic to become irritation, which was an emotional state she understood much better. They descended. The surface became a bright, shifting ceiling above them. Then Yessa looked down and forgot to complain. The reef rose from the seafloor in impossible color. Life occupied every useful surface and several that did not appear useful at all. Branching corals formed layered structures crowded with fish. Crustaceans moved through crevices. Small animals cleaned parasites from larger ones. Thin-bodied fish turned sideways and vanished against rock. Yessa had spent years studying alien ecosystems through instruments. The difference between knowing biodiversity statistics and having several hundred animals move around her at once was humiliating. A mottled shape beside the reef opened one eye. Yessa jerked backward. Celia turned. Scorpionfish. It was a rock. It was pretending. Yessa moved closer and reached out. Celia caught her wrist before she touched it. Don't. Why? Venomous spines. Yessa withdrew her hand. A brilliantly colored animal crawled over the reef several meters away. Yessa pointed. Also don't touch, Celia said. Toxic. Very. Yessa indicated a striped fish. Venomous. A cone-shaped mollusk rested beneath an overhang. Yessa had learned enough to ask first. Dangerous. Potentially. How? Venomous harpoon. Yessa stopped moving. Celia waited. Yessa gestured toward the entire reef. Does this ecosystem have a visual language for danger? Sometimes. Sometimes. Warning colors, camouflage, mimicry, courtship, species recognition. Depends on the animal. Yessa looked at a bright yellow fish that seemed morally opposed to camouflage. This ecosystem refuses to label anything properly. Celia's mask hid her mouth, but not her eyes. She was laughing. Yessa turned away. The reef was beautiful. That was deeply inconvenient. 20 minutes later, a gray shape appeared beyond the coral. Yessa recognized predation before she recognized the animal. Shark moved with an efficiency that required no translation. It passed behind a coral column, emerged again, and angled closer. Yessa struck Celia's arm hard enough to be felt through both suits. Celia looked at the shark, then at Yessa. No alarm. The animal passed perhaps 15 meters away and continued along the reef. Only after it disappeared did Yessa speak. That was a predator. Yes, you did not leave. Reef sharks generally aren't interested in us. Yessa stared through her mask. You have categorized predators according to which ones are usually uninterested in eating you. Celia paused. That is one way to phrase it. Yessa decided not to ask for the other ways. The current changed during the return leg. At first it was only a sideways pull. Then the reef began moving beneath them faster than Yessa expected. She kicked harder. The ocean ignored her effort. Celia reached her immediately. Don't fight it. We are moving away from the boat. We're moving toward the secondary recovery point. Yessa looked in the indicated direction and saw only water. Celia checked depth, remaining gas, current, and position, then contacted the surface team. Current came up early. We're terminating the original route. We'll drift south and ascend at marker 3. There was no frustration in her voice. No attempt to salvage the planned path because they had already invested time in it. They angled across the current instead of directly against it. The difference was immediate. The ocean stopped feeling like an opponent. It became terrain that happened to move. They surfaced near the secondary recovery point and the boat collected them a few minutes later. Yessa climbed aboard on unsteady limbs. Celia checked her breathing system before removing her own gear. "The current changed your plan," Yessa said. "Yes, you abandoned the route immediately. Of course, you did not attempt to overcome it." Celia looked back at the water. "Ocean wins arguments, saves time if you accept that early." Yessa stared at the reef. That sentence made more sense than almost everything humans had said about recreational diving. Chapter 4. Most of it is dark. Yessa returned to the Institute with a revised hypothesis. She had underestimated the productivity and complexity of Earth's shallow marine ecosystems. That was embarrassing but manageable. Celia ruined the correction over breakfast. Yessa had a depth chart open beside her meal. The reef they had visited occupied a tiny band near the top. "The reef explains the apparent contradiction," Yessa said. "Biological abundance is concentrated where sunlight and nutrient exchange are favorable." Celia glanced at the chart. "That's definitely part of it." Yessa froze. "Part." Celia drank her coffee. Yessa had learned to fear that silence. She pointed at the abyssal zone. "What lives there? A lot of things. That is not a taxonomic answer. Fish, jellies, squid, crustaceans, worms, microbes, scavengers." "Stop." Celia stopped. Yessa looked from the dark band to the surface. "No sunlight." "Correct. Near freezing water across enormous regions." "Yes." "Extreme pressure." "Yes." "And enough complex life that you can list categories casually." "Yes." Yessa narrowed her eyes. "I want direct evidence." Celia put down her cup. "Okay." Yessa closed her eyes. "No, you just asked." "I recognize that tone now." "What tone?" "The one preceding equipment." Celia smiled. 2 days later, Yessa stood beside a submersible named Lantern House and calculated the load on its viewport. Twice. The pilot, Tomas Vale, watched from the forward seat while she checked the number a third time. "It's certified," he said. "Certification does not reduce the pressure." "No." "Then humans should stop using the word as though it does." Tomas laughed. Yessa decided she disliked him. The submersible entered the Pacific shortly after dawn. For the first few hundred meters, sunlight followed them. Fish crossed the viewport. The surface remained a distant brightness overhead. Then red vanished from the world. Orange followed. Yellow faded. Blue deepened until even blue surrendered. The exterior lamps became the only daylight. Yessa watched the depth increase. There was no horizon outside, no visible surface. Eventually, there was not even a seafloor. Only instruments told them where they were. Celia leaned forward. "Turn the lights off for a moment." Yessa looked at her. "They are currently the only useful thing outside." "That's why." Tomas killed the lamps. Darkness swallowed the submersible. Then a point of green light appeared beyond the viewport. Another flashed below it. A thin blue line pulsed in the black, disappeared, and answered from somewhere farther away. Yessa leaned forward. "What is that?" "Life," Celia said. The humor was gone from her voice. Another organism drifted past. Its body was almost invisible except for a row of pale lights. More flashes appeared in the distance. Signals, perhaps, lures, warnings, mating displays, predation. Yessa could not classify any of them from this distance. For several seconds she forgot the pressure. The darkness had not been empty. It had simply been using a spectrum her eyes had not expected. Tomas restored the lamps. A translucent animal drifted across the viewport, internal structures visible through its body. Yessa stared at it. "This should not exist." Celia settled back in her seat. "That phrase is going to get repetitive." For once, Yessa could not disagree. Chapter 5. What falls from above. The seafloor eventually emerged from darkness. Flat sediment stretched beyond the lamps. Life was sparse. Yessa felt a small, private surge of vindication. Then Tomas angled the submersible toward a pale shape ahead. Ribs rose from the sediment. A skull rested partly buried nearby. Yessa leaned closer. "What was it?" "A whale," Celia said. "One of the air-breathing marine megafauna." "Yes. It died here. Probably died near the surface and sank." The remains should have been an ending. They were not. Crustaceans moved between the bones. Fish searched the sediment. Worms occupied the surrounding substrate. Specialized organisms had penetrated the skeleton itself. Yessa watched one disappear into a rib. "This is an ecosystem, part of one, built around a corpse." Celia looked at the whale fall. "Deep ocean doesn't get a lot of large food deliveries. When one arrives, things use it." Yessa considered the kilometers of water above them. At the surface, sunlight drove enormous biological production. Some of that material sank as particles. Some descended inside animals. Sometimes an entire giant body fell from the bright world into the dark and fed organisms for years. The layers were not separate. The deep survived partly on what the surface surrendered. Yessa opened her notes. She had intended to document biological limits. She was beginning to document connections instead. Tomas changed course. Yessa noticed immediately. "Where are we going?" "Vent field," Celia said. Yessa looked at her. "What kind of vent?" "Hydrothermal." "Volcanic." "Geothermal." "That is a diplomatic synonym for volcanic," Tomas answered without turning around. "We're approaching an active vent field, yes." "How close?" "Close enough to observe, not close enough to cook the vehicle." Yessa's neck membranes flared. That distinction should not need to exist. Chapter 6. A world without sunlight. The first sign of the vent field was chemical. Sensors detected reduced sulfur compounds and dissolved metals. Temperature gradients appeared across the seafloor. Mineral staining spread over the rock. The water outside remained near freezing. Some of the fluid rising from below was not. Yessa read the chemistry and felt the certainty of her profession return. "Nothing complex should live directly beside this." Celia said nothing. Yessa looked over. The human was watching the forward viewport. "Why are you not arguing?" "Because we're almost there." Lantern House rounded a ridge. Tomas brought the exterior lamps to full intensity. Black smokers rose from the seabed like ruined towers. Dark, mineral-rich water poured from their openings and billowed upward into the cold ocean. Around them was life, not an occasional scavenger, not one improbable animal crossing an empty plain. Dense communities clustered along the chemical and thermal gradients. Pale tube worms rose in groups. Crustaceans moved across mineral surfaces. Microbial mats coated the rock. Other animals occupied the spaces where toxic heat became merely difficult. Yessa leaned toward the viewport until one of her manipulators touched the glass. "No," Celia still said nothing. Yessa checked the sensor readings herself. No sunlight, extreme pressure, geological instability, chemistry hostile to many surface organisms, and yet the community outside was not barely surviving. It was structured around those conditions. "What powers this?" "Chemosynthesis," Celia said. "Microbes use chemical energy from the vent compounds. Everything else builds from there." Yessa knew the mechanism. Caudron science had documented chemosynthetic ecosystems on several worlds. That knowledge did not make the view less astonishing. The vent field was not alive in spite of its boundaries. Life had organized itself around the boundaries. Yessa began requesting data, spectral measurements, temperature maps, chemical gradients, species distribution, mineral composition. Celia answered what she knew and let the instruments answer the rest. Yessa took notes until one manipulator cramped. Then she stopped. A different question had been building for the entire descent. She turned toward Celia. "You evolved on land. Yes, you cannot breathe here. No, your body cannot tolerate the ambient pressure. Definitely not. This water would disable you quickly without thermal protection." "Yes," Yessa gestured around the submersible. "And your species built this machine, descended several kilometers into darkness, and came here to observe organisms beside an underwater volcanic system." Celia looked out at the vent field. "Yes. Why?" The human considered the question for only a moment. "We wanted to know what was here." Yessa waited for the deeper explanation. None came. "That is the entire reason?" "Pretty much." Yessa looked back at the vents. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she could not produce an objection. The machine around her was already the argument. Chapter 7. Visitors. Seismic alarm sounded 9 minutes later. Yessa's body tightened against the restraint harness. Tomas checked the panel. "Small local event." Celia had already stopped recording. "Do we need to move?" Tomas looked at the plume monitor, then at the navigation display. "Yes." He did not say maybe. He did not wait for a second alarm. Lantern House backed away from the vent field. Yessa watched the towers recede through the rear viewport. One by one, their illuminated shapes disappeared into darkness. No one argued that they had traveled thousands of kilometers to Earth and then several kilometers downward. No one requested one final sample. No one tried to extract maximum value from the expedition by remaining until danger became certain. They left. Once they were clear, Yessa looked at Celia. "You did not wait for confirmation that the event was dangerous." "No." "Why?" "Because we were already where the consequences would be bad. That is risk avoidance." "Yes." Yessa studied her. The human seemed surprised that this required explanation. "You crossed an ocean in a vessel, took an alien diving in an environment neither of you can breathe, descended into the abyss inside a pressure hull, approached an active vent field, and you are describing yourselves as risk-averse." Celia smiled slightly. I said we avoid stupid risks. That's not the same thing as avoiding all risk. Lantern House began the long ascent. Yessa watched the depth numbers fall. She thought about the reef and the current. Every emergency procedure in the equipment room, the shark Celia had respected without fearing. The pressure hull around them, the immediate retreat from the vent field. Humans did not conquer the ocean. That had been Yessa's mistake. Conquest implied the environment eventually agreed to human terms. The ocean did not. Humans entered on negotiated terms instead. A breathing system because water would not provide air. A pressure hull because the abyss would not forgive exposed tissue. A dive plan because currents did not care where humans wanted to go. A retreat when geology changed the conditions. The ocean remained stronger at every stage. Humans went anyway, carefully, prepared, curious, and when necessary, willing to leave. That last part mattered more than Yessa had expected. Curiosity without restraint was simply another path to extinction. Chapter 8. Revision. Yessa's original paper survived 2 more days. Then she deleted the title. Probable biological limits of high-pressure Terran marine environments disappeared from her screen 1 word at a time. Celia found her staring at the blank line. You look angry. I am editing. You always look angry while editing. Good editing requires hostility. That explains academics. Yessa ignored her and typed a new title. Biodiversity across extreme Terran marine environments. Celia read it. Less confident. More accurate. Yessa opened a section containing her original assumptions: pressure, darkness, cold, nutrient scarcity, chemical toxicity, geological instability. She had written them as exclusions. Now she rewrote them as variables. Celia watched from over her shoulder. How many things were wrong? Yessa did not look up. That is not the correct question. What is? How many were incomplete? Celia nodded. Yessa added images. The reef. Bioluminescent organisms suspended in black water. Whale fall. The vent field. Then she paused over an image taken inside Lantern House. A black smoker rose beyond the viewport. Celia's reflection was faintly visible in the glass. Human, surface-born, breathing air inside a machine at the bottom of an ocean her body could not survive. Yessa left the image in the paper. The location and depth were sufficient caption. The rest of the argument did not need help. 3 months later, Yessa presented the revised work to a crowded institute auditorium. Her conclusions were received well. She disliked how much of that satisfaction came from having been wrong in an interesting way. Afterward, a junior Caudron researcher approached her. I read your preliminary abstract from before the Earth visit. Yessa's membranes tightened. That document should have been destroyed. It was archived. Of course it was. The researcher hesitated. What changed your mind? Yessa could have discussed chemosynthesis. She could have explained pressure adaptation, trophic connections, biological gradients, or the ecological role of rare resource falls. Instead, she thought of a current pulling her away from a boat. She thought of Celia saying not to fight it. Direct observation, Yessa said. The researcher nodded as though that answer were ordinary. Yessa almost laughed. On Earth, apparently it was. Epilogue. Under the ice. Yessa was scheduled to return to Caudron in 11 days. Celia found her near the observation gallery where Earth rotated beyond the glass, far too much blue. I'm leaving before you, Celia said. Yessa became suspicious immediately. Another expedition? Antarctica. Yessa had studied enough human geography to dislike the word. Land. Celia's expression changed, very slightly. No. Yessa turned toward her. What do you mean no? We're surveying a marine ecosystem under an ice shelf. We'll send vehicles through an access bore. Yessa raised both manipulator arms. No, Celia nodded. Fair. She started walking away. Yessa watched her go. Pressure, darkness, venom, predators, currents, underwater volcanoes. Humans had already introduced her to all of those. Now the human intended to put ice over the ocean as well. Yessa hated the question before she asked it. She lasted 3 seconds. How deep? Celia stopped. Then she smiled.